And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Change and Working Lands session. Thank you for your attendance. My name is Nora Álvarez, and I am representing the Climate Center Hub. As mentioned before, this session is focused on climate change and the effect on working lands in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico are facing the effects of climate change and extreme weather in the tropical agriculture systems are more vulnerable to the changes in this region for many reasons. Many of our farmers are small scale farmers with limited resources, and many times they lack the resources to be able to adapt to these changes. Many of our species as coffee are more sensible to the changes in precipitation and temperature than other fruits in the climate change in a region is also affecting the dairy and cattle because there is a lack of food, and it is increasing the thermic stress in the animals. In terms of we are expecting a diminution in precipitation in the forest. Among the most vulnerable areas, we have the mountains in Luquillo, El Yunque. Despite these difficulties, there are opportunities after the disaster. So we are recovering wood fallen during the hurricanes, and we have several community initiatives to increase the food productivity. In this panel, we have 4 experts. Without further ado, I introduce our first panelist, Mr. Pedro Ríos. First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity of being here with you. Since we are 4 panelists and we want to have enough time for everyone, I will go directly to the presentation. What I would like to give you is a background for you to visualize how in El Yunque, as the Forest Service, we just finished writing our planning management plan, talking about the climate change. And we are required, among the guidelines, to have a collaboration with the neighboring communities. And what you're going to see is an example of how we are achieving this and where are we nowadays in terms of the climate change. So basically, this is an exercise that we work with many meetings, more than 90 meetings that we held. And I am going to talk with our vision because it changed the dynamic of how the forest is managed. And it leads us to view it in a different way. To keep an accessible, healthy forest for multiple uses, because the forest is used for recreation, to water, and it is important to have a language in the book that we provide environmental, cultural, and social and economic opportunities. And we're talking about how to improve the quality of life for the neighboring communities. And we're talking also about environmental justice. It is included in this vision, and we are keeping the cultural and environmental identity and awareness for the conservation of its natural resources in an inclusive manner. This is a new subject that is required within the agency, and you're going to see it in the future. Everything starts because in 2010, the agency did a national sustainability report where they assess the condition of the forest in the US. And as a result of this exercise, they changed the model on how to manage the forest. Instead of separating the environment, the society, and the economy, we changed to these concentric circles that you see on the right-hand side. And it is strengthening the concept of managing the forest. The important thing is that it led the agency later to promote a public policy from the Secretary of Agriculture, where he is telling us that we are going to manage the land within an all lands concept. All the lands have the same importance, and we acknowledge that all the land, not only the national forest, it may be private or public, they are all important economic and environmental assets, and they are fundamental. At the same time, it requires that the management needs to be collaborative in terms of resilience to climate change, the protection of the water resources, and improving the forest health, creating employment opportunities. So this is a direct quote from the new public policy. So now it is not exclusive within the protected public lands, but it extends the policy to how to manage it outside the ownership of the forest. We started in 2007 with this process of the new planning because what we do, the agency changed the model for planning. Now the planning model consists of an evaluation, an assessment, a plan, and a declaration of impact. But within the concept of all lands, if we are seeing the Sierra de Luquillo, and we see on the map is that basically within the black lines, you see a lighter green, and that's the belongs to the forest. The black line is where you have a proclamation zone, but the black lines that is defined by the tropical land, and we define the required line to maintain this Sierra de Luquillo functioning. And that's what we took us later to the planning process to define a region that you're going to see in a little bit. And here's the definition. Basically, this new regulation allows us for the first time to define geographical areas. And what is the importance of this? It allows us to extend our policies and conservation guidelines to be extended down to the coast. We're not going to make decisions outside El Yunque, but we are going to try to promote this conservation project and restoration. And it is defined this way. The north is providing access to recreation environments highly developed and organized in Luquillo and Rio Grande. The west and south with an emphasis in community and environmental-based enterprises promoting social well-being. And the S, that is basically Ceiba and Fajardo, it is to manage the water areas because these are impacted by the wind that comes from the east, and it affects the precipitation. But it is really important in the context that we are starting to see what are the issues that we have in terms of climate change. And fundamental issues or planning problems, the high precipitation in the forest, in El Yunque, they cause a deterioration of the facilities, roads, pathways, and that's the key problem within the climate change context. So what we look in the plan is to see how we can displace the use of the forest to other areas, and you're going to see it now. And basically in the planning, we divided the forest, all the acres, and we took all the land that is surrounding the forest in low elevations, the El Verde, Nahuabo, and we call it a community interface resource management area. And we eliminated all the restrictions, and we provide that space to the community so that they can use the land for recreation, pathways, new roads, etc. But everything within a context that the problem, the ground, in that area is more permeable, and they have more problems in the maintenance of the facilities because the precipitation with the climate change, it is increasing. Sometimes we have dry periods and sometimes we have excess rain, and it damages the roads. and it limits the uses of the forest. So we are trying to displace it to lower altitude locations. But we still have an effect of the climate change in terms of the cost of how to maintain the roads and the forest. So when this idea was created about managing the forest in the lower part of the mountain, then we started trying to work with the communities. And the plan, we are called to work with the communities. Previously, we worked with ourselves, and now we need to work with the communities. And we designed a mechanism where we have a practice field and different communities. We have several communities in the East, around 150 communities, and we limited to a subset of 8 or 9 communities. And on each community, we practice something different to learn together. And the community of Barcelona, in Rio Grande, in Palmer, La Vega, we have a project on how to develop entrepreneurship in the community-based companies and in the context of climate change. What these communities are facing is because of the change in temperatures. When the climate is changing, they receive a lot of people for recreation without any control using the river. So the communities need to face this. And at the same time, they are trying to capture some economical benefit when they are receiving more visitors. They were not prepared for this. The climate change is changing the visitation pattern, and the community is reacting. So the community of Pasto Seco y Las Piedras, it is in the south area of the forest, and they are facing problems with lack of water and a variation of the water that is supplied not only by the water company, but by the river. So we are working on a study with the Cornell University and the community in Aguabo. We have a high number of visitors, and the community is balancing the use of the river and the nature. And lastly, in Luquillo, the Savannah community is also affected by the water, and we are working with a water company to see how we may improve the quality of water. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, Pedro, for your presentation. We are going to have an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation for the other panelists. And now we have Dr. Guillermo Ortiz Colón. He's a specialist in dairy cattle nutrition from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez campus, and he's working in promoting strategies for adaptation to minimize the carbon footprint in the production of dairy milk and to be more resistant to the challenge of climate change. And he's going to talk to us about resilience and adaptation to climate change, the case study of the dairy industry of Puerto Rico. Well, good afternoon. I am going to talk to you about the dairy industry in Puerto Rico and regarding the climate change, using an example of the Hurricane Maria experience. And to give you some background, the dairy industry in Puerto Rico, okay, I'm sorry. It is a agricultural industry that is most important in Puerto Rico, and they are responsible for almost a fourth of the revenues from agriculture. And within the animal industry, it is almost 60% of the agriculture. It is animal agriculture, and the revenues come from the dairy industry. Nonetheless, the productivity of the dairy industry in Puerto Rico have not increased with time, despite the cost increasing. And that is combined with a problem that we changed the production system from the 60s to a high density of animals nowadays, and it doesn't allow the farmer to use this food resource in an efficient way. And they are forced to depend on imported grain or feed, and almost 50% of the production costs of the cattle and dairy industry are from imported feed. And the pay that the price that is paid to the farmer has not increased proportionally to the production cost. And that's why many industries, dairy farms have been closing because the economic situation of the farmers is not prospering, because many of the things that we are going to talk that we need to change requires a capital investment. Now the price is 6.47 for a gallon of milk, and we have seen a decrease in the sale of the milk. So thinking that we may increase the price is not feasible. So this was a situation when Maria impacted us. And the problem is then, to summarize in terms of the milk production in Puerto Rico, they already had an economic problem when the Hurricane Maria impacted us. So you may have an idea of how Hurricane Maria went across Puerto Rico, and on the next one you may see the location of the dairy farms in Puerto Rico. So practically it affected the heart of the dairy industry in Puerto Rico, Atillo, Arecibo, and Camuy. And next one. In this case, I am going to share some information that was provided by the cooperative of production of milk and by the Office of Milk of Dairy Regulations in Puerto Rico. And these pictures were provided by the student Monica Ruiz Ramos, and she had a research project, and when the hurricane impacted us, we need to change her project. The impact was immediate and the milk production was affected dramatically as a consequence of the hurricane impact by a 55%. But the cows and the simplicity of the industry, it made possible for the milk production to recuperate faster than the market. So the hurricane affected the productivity and the cows, but the problem was that there was no market for the milk that was produced by the cows shortly after the hurricane, because there was a decrease of 75% in the market. And this was because the residents didn't have any power, so we were not able to refrigerate the product, and we had no schools, so there was no market for this milk that was produced. Then, despite the cooperative of milk producers increased the production of UHT milk that needs no refrigeration, even though they were processing this excess of milk after the hurricane, it was not enough to manage the amount of milk that was available without any market in Puerto Rico. At the end of the day, as a consequence of the hurricane, millions of liters of milk were discarded, and it was a loss of $5.96 million for the producers. And also, by February, 60% of the dairy farmers still didn't have any power, and they were forced to milk the cows twice a day. So they needed to use power generations, and that tripled the energy cost. But this was not reflected on the price that was paid to the farmer. We also lost more than 4,500 heads of cattle, equivalent to a loss of $6 to $9 million. And the infrastructure, we had catastrophic losses in more than 40 million in infrastructure. So at the end of the day, more than $55 million were lost as a consequence of Hurricane Maria. So as I was mentioning, the problem is that probably we are going to face an experience like this again. And so it is possible. And after this experience, what can we do? The first thing that caught my attention is that we need to rethink the engineering for a dairy farm, because on the right-hand side, on the left, we can see a destroyed dairy farm, and on the right-hand side, we see a dairy that was built in 1958 and it is still standing. So we forgot how to build to face a hurricane. So we need to use other alternatives. The cows lost the shade because we lost the trees overnight, and the animals didn't have any shade. So we need to look for alternatives to provide this shade to the animals in case we had another hurricane. And thinking about the temperatures that they are going to continue increasing with time, we need to rethink the animals that we are using to produce milk in Puerto Rico. In this case, we have evidence in Puerto Rico that we have animals that are adapted to the tropics, like the Holstein slick hair cows, that they are genetically adapted to the tropics, or there are some other initiatives of maybe introducing other breeds that are adapted to the tropics. And in this case, you may click so you can see the animation. In this case, we can see that the non-slick versus the slick Holstein cows produce more milk than the European cows. Another way of thinking in response to the climate change is combining the dairy farm with silvopastoreo systems, and this will help the cattle and the milk, and also as a carbon bank that is eco-friendly. And what other things we should think about? I think that the dairy farms in Puerto Rico should be independent of the centralized power and water authorities. They should be off the grid. They should be self-sufficient with solar panels, methane harvesting forms of energy. And here are some examples of water collection, rainwater collection. So on the next hurricane, we should not depend on the centralized production of energy to continue operations. Another thing that happened is that the feed mills were not working because they didn't have any power, or the trucks weren't able to get to the dairy farms. So we should promote that our agricultures depend more on the pastures, on producing proteins in their farms and using conservation elements so they have the feed available for the next hurricane. And in case we had an excess of rain or some drought or any other climate phenomena. We need to decentralize the milk production because that was a problem that we saw after Hurricane Maria. And also we need to decentralize the milk processing because that was also a problem because we had the 3 processing plants without any power. And now to end my presentation, that's what we need to do in order to be prepared for the climate change. And I just wanted now to provide you some details. The dairy industry, the mills, they are blamed as responsible for the global warming, but that's because the data that they are using globally, and they are including countries that have a high population of bovines with low productivity. But when we analyze the same data in developed countries, and Puerto Rico is a middle point, we can see that the dairy farm does not contribute so much. So these are data that are using as an example the US, and you may see that the major impact for the global warming of the GHG do not come from agriculture, and it is less than 1% of the GHG. But I just wanted to say that the milk is really important. These cows are a defense line, and they could provide food in terms of an emergency. And the next one, that is the last one. As you can see here, if you can click 2 more. Milk, it contributes to the GHG compared with other products, for example, like wine and beer. It is favorable because it has a high nutrient density. And that would be all on my end because we are running out of time. Thank you. Thank you very much, Guillermo. Now we're going to have the third. Her name is Lisette Fat. Lisette is founder and director of Cafiesencia. It is an organization that since 2008 applies a holistic vision to the rural communities for the sustainable economical development, where the conservation, education, and preservation of our heritage is integrated. So she's going to talk to us about the work in the coffee regions in Puerto Rico. And thank you, Lisette, for being part of this panel.
Hola, buenas tardes, ¿me escuchan
Hello
bien?
and good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Yes, now we do. Thank you very much to the organizers of this event for inviting us and for sharing with us in this forum. For the short time that we have, I have a few notes that we understand that through our experience and some recommendations and observations, so we are able to have feasible practices regarding the climate change in the region of the coffee region in Puerto Rico. Nowadays, many of the coffee farmers and land custodians are very aware of the climate change and its effect, mostly because they see it day to day in their land. Are they willing to do something about it? Yes. Now, there are two main barriers, and that's the financial feasibility and the labor. We want to focus on these two components because that's what we see on the field. And many times it is heartbreaking to see how many of our farmers are small farmers. They don't have a lot of resources. And I remind you that the coffee region, these municipalities, they have a high rate of poverty. And if we see the geographical area, it is much more difficult to be a farmer in the mountain than in the coastal areas. And that's why we understand that these people who are disadvantaged, we should try to give them equal access. And that equals access, we understand that it may be through expert resources to make them be more competitive, to have the same level as the others who have more resources. And we are talking about going beyond the management plan, the business plan, and how we have experimented with other options that may be affecting this. An example, some of us work with FEMA projects and managing cases, so we know a little bit about how they are working. And one of the things that really caught our attention is that it was an emergency, but FEMA was working in a different way. They were assigning case managers, in this case, to families. And there they were helping all these families, and they were taking them by the hand, step by step, so they could get the assistance to rebuild their homes and their lives. And that is a concept that is very similar to being a facilitator, a coordinator, an advisor up to a certain point. But the important thing is that they continue providing the assistance, going beyond to take them to the action. And in order to take them to the action, we need to make sure that this is financially feasible. And that is part of the formula that we have not a clear idea yet. For example, in agricultural extension, they have a technological set, and what they do is that they measure the cost effectiveness of the farming, and this is really important when we're talking about implementation. Another issue that we need to consider is we need to have a quicker, agile, flexible access to funds. For example, USDA Rural Development, they flexibilize their requirements for some programs that they have for housing, to build, to repair, and to purchase a house. And in terms, instead of asking for an ownership title, they are asking for letters from the neighbors to witness that, yes, this person has lived in this house for 10 years already, or we have seen that they are working, that they live in that house, but to see in what way, like rural development did, that we could do it also for this kind of coffee farmers who are in a disadvantaged situation. Another situation that we are facing with FEMA, and it was very interesting, and while we are expecting the funds, we knew that there were organizations or entities that were presenting to the municipality an opportunity for us. We are going to advance the FEMA funds, and we are going to be responsible for collecting the rents. And what I mean is that maybe creating an intermediary fund that could advance these funds, because if they have to wait for 6 months or a year in many cases for the reimbursement, the bigger farmers could wait for it, but not the smaller farmers. So that really is very difficult for those who would like to adopt this kind of practice. And we know of Fundación Comunitaria is one of the entities, and they are dealing with this kind of funds. We shouldn't close ourselves to offer what is a reimbursement. Let's look for some other way that can really help these people to have the funds as an advancement, or maybe through entities that could provide it. And the other important issue is that we need to go into market, profitable markets, and they need a lot of assistance. And we understand that we may develop them through experts in markets, in sales, also in exportations, or representatives. It may be different, the concept, but the idea is to be able to be competent, not telling them there are those markets and deal with them. No, we need to hire a group of people, a team. We need to identify entities that may get the entrance to those markets. Another thing is that we need to assess the connection with investments. And those are some things that we should look beyond of what is offered. And the bottom line is that we need to close that gap. We need to get these coffee farmers to have the same opportunities to be competent in those markets, and they could incorporate eco-friendly practices and conservation practices. And the other situation in the coffee farmer sector and in other agriculture sectors is the labor issue. We don't have a lot of hands and trained and skilled laborers, and many of the coffee farmers, some of them are already in the program, or they are in the process of applying for the permits, and they are applying for H2A to bring foreign labor. The cost for these are higher, and they require proper housing, transportation, food, etc. So these are really high costs for small farmers. So how can we get these smaller farmers and meat farmers to have the same opportunity to get this labor? We need to work together with the municipalities, with the different agencies, what mechanisms or entities we could implement to ensure that these smaller coffee farmers have the same access to this program. Next one. Other considerations are to create the awareness, capacity building, because not all of them know the different practices and what it requires. We need to ensure that we have a quality product. We need to work with model farms. The communication, all of us, all the agencies, we have a lot of communications that we release, but we need to organize ourselves to be more effective. We need to measure how that communication is provided. We also need to consider the climate effects on other activities like tourism, because that is another activity that we are supporting for more than a decade in order for them to expand their revenues through activities like hiking and bird watching that do not require large investment, and at the same time they are activities that are very respectful to the environment. Climate smart. It should be defined as financial feasibility, an economical feasibility, and successful practices. That is what defines climate smart. Another consideration is, can climate smart be branded as it was for USDA organic? Nowadays, the USDA organic seal is known by everyone, but 10 years ago, it was not like that. So starting a brand requires a long-term commitment and a maintenance to that brand. But I think that it may be possible and it may be as important as the USDA organic brand. The process of honey coffee, this coffee is processed in a different way. Basically, it is when you extract the pulp from the coffee and you dry it. And what the ones that we have tasted that coffee, we have realized that it has a lot more flavors and sensations, and usually you have a higher rate in terms of the quality of this coffee. But at the same time, we understand that it may be climate smart because of their process that they are carrying out and the financial feasibility. We also see that this coffee could be sold at a higher price because the market and the new taste nowadays, they're always looking for this. And also they're looking for a traceability of where it comes from, how was it processed. So I understand that we have 2 points in our favor of the honey coffee. Thank you very much. And I am available to respond to any questions that you may have. Excellent, Lisette, and thank you for this environmental and climate justice in the coffee farming industry. And now we have Giardo Gonzalez. He is a forester with many years of experience in forest initiatives. He worked for as a forester for the Department of Natural Resources for many years, and now he is working as a forester for the Center for the Landscape Conservation, and he's going to talk about observations of forest management facing the climate change in the Caribbean. And your presentation looks a little bit weird, Edgardo. Okay, I will try to go over it quickly. Mainly, I would like to go to the part of practice recommendations. So next one. One of the first issues that I would like to highlight is that the climate events, and the next one, please. Historically, they have happened in Puerto Rico, and it really depends on the frequency and intensity. And next one. And there are many reports in Puerto Rico that they are talking about how the forests recovered themselves, mainly after Hurricane Hugo. And it is really important that one of the factors that we need to consider is the historical use of the land in order to have an idea how the forest can recuperate or recover itself. Historically, these disturbances that we have seen in Puerto Rico, maybe they were not so associated with the forest because we didn't have those forests because they were in private hands. But some documentation talks about 245 families depended on wood in the Cambalache forest. So there was a dynamic of the use of the land, deforestation because of the intensity of the agriculture use, and that variable of having so many wood on the ground. That was a point that was highlighted after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. They were not so evident. So that social need of using the land for agriculture use changed the perspective, and the actors in terms of the ownership of the land, most of the forests are in private hands right now. And as you can see in the slide, in the past, right now we have many forest lands in Puerto Rico. How we can manage this nowadays, these two graphics, two charts, present those points that Lisette was talking previously. We have less people in Puerto Rico, fewer people. We have fewer labor hands in Puerto Rico. And the chart also shows how the trees responded, comparing Hugo in red and Maria in blue. And the biggest difference that we can see in these charts is in the amount of trees that were broken, but not necessarily died, and how we can see this today in the forest and how it is different to what we had before. Nowadays, the forest has a condition that mostly we have an interface with the urban areas. Next one, please. And here we can see how it looks nowadays, the landscape, and we have houses that are bordering the forest. We have agriculture impact, and we are seeing forest areas, and we saw many of those wood mountains that we see in the middle. So what are some of the recommendations that we have for the management of the forest? It is important that most of the working lands are identified, and there's a lot of information. We have the preference for that the paper, and we develop a map that is talking about a conservation area with the possibility of agricultural use, forest use, and I would like to highlight that this conservation area, and when we're talking about conservation, we are focusing more on protection, not so much in use, but we may use it as an alternative of areas that could have a reduced impact use. So these were productive areas, as we can see on this map. And historically, it changed. These were vanilla cultivation in the forest. So we may see different alternatives that we may consider within this landscape, and which practices should we work with. And now we are going to move to some recommendations. Resilient species. And in the observation, I would like to highlight that when the hurricane is coming, everything is urgent. There is no water, no power, the forests are affected, and we need to reforest. And so we need to see the alternatives on how we could prepare ourselves. And the practices. Maybe some trees were bent or broken, but they stayed there. And instead of looking for places who are uh, a lot of deforestation, where we have a lot of competition, because there's a lot of sun coming to that area, some of the practices that we follow is to be more strategic on how we are going to make that forest more resilient. What species were affected, what species we may introduce, and how we can differentiate them with different practices. In terms of practices, when we're talking about forest management, when we talk about forest coverage recovery, the timber stand improvements, when we are pruning some species, is what we recommended for some owners, and also the reduction of vines, because it creates a lot of resistance to the winds. Remember that in Irma and Maria were only 2 weeks apart. So we need to constantly apply these preparations to create the resistance and be more resilient. Another strategy that we understand that is feasible is what we call natural assisted regeneration. Instead of reforesting some areas, what are the trees that were resilient, which ones survived, which we can monitor and see how some of these plant tools could be used to reforest some areas within the farm. That way, the agriculture may have their own seeds and plant tools within their farms, and they could do this gradually, so they don't get involved in a large area of planting, because we don't have so many people to work. So the natural assisted regeneration could be used to create patches of more resilient forests, and also to work with more sensitive species. In this case, there is a work that we are working with Tabonuco, and basically we are creating patches in areas where they are defined as a conservation area for that species, and what is the response that these species are having and how we can work them. The tools are very simple. With a one-day training, and a landowner could select a patch of their land to work this way. And the invasive species monitoring and low-cost control practices. This is a job that is being done in El Yunque with some species that have been identified. It is simple job, low cost, and we are creating patches where the species are eliminated, and we are introducing native species to create a balance for these invasive species. And this is an observation that we should have in different areas to develop these practices. How we should see the financial aspect, it's really important. And the social resources, the nutrition is very important. Previously, I presented the alternative to see the forest as a shelter, with a shelter effect for supply. For example, with the coffee farming, that's an alternative. And we are seeing that now we are activating what we call analog forestry, and we're working with the structure of the forest, and we need to integrate food production trees to the forest. And this is a market not for an extreme production market. We are not looking for the forest owner to become a farmer with a large production, but they may have some spaces within the forest that they could integrate within the forest structure, some options for food, that in case that there is some event, they may have this alternative. We have spoken with farmers with large plantations of bananas, and we are creating small pockets in the areas of the forest to protect the seed. So if a hurricane is coming, they may protect smaller areas to preserve the seed. And they are aware that their forest serve as a shelter for some species that were affected. I don't want to end without giving some urban context. And people get a little bit creative, and we see a tree that is tied with many cables so it may survive, and it is very close to the curve. And we are going to see flooding also species that are not adapted to this kind of situation, and the reforestation of particular areas to create to face the impact on the coast. And so there are some nurseries that are created for some species. And we also need to talk about the wood, that this is a public policy issue, and how we can manage that excess of wood that will happen after an event. Another issue is that we should monitor places that have been used for certain practices after some disturbances. For example, this happened with the PR10 road that was built on the Rio Abajo forest, and how they managed refilling some sinkholes that were water sources within the channeling system of the forest. So these practices have the same resistance nowadays. And I highlight this because we should monitor this, because this is going to have an effect on some species, and we should monitor some areas, especially in naturally protected areas. And what we would like to highlight here is that the main recommendation that I would like to provide is to focus in the structure of the forest. We try to see the structure of the forest and how it ends after a climate event, that it may be a hurricane or it may be a fire, what stands, what doesn't die. So we need to combine the production of wood producing trees, fruit production trees. We need to consider the height and the width of the trees, and it is going to help the wildlife within the forest. And this is another financial option for the owner of the land, and an alternate source of food for the owner of these lands. And this is the message. Most of all, we need to focus on having this structure and see how we can manage that structure. And this is important because when the hurricane comes, everything is important, and we need to focus also on how to be more efficient before the events. And I think that we should work on the self-criticism when we work with landowners, the agencies, how efficient we are. And we need to refocus some of the strategies to cover not only the ecology response and the economical and social components as well. And that will be all.
Muchas gracias, Edgardo.
Thank you very much, Edgardo. This panel has been excellent.